Tonight we have John Bensinger is going to give us part two on his presentation, By Whose Authority? So take it away, John.
All right. Well, thank you all. Um, so as Don mentioned, this is going to be part two of the presentation. And if you hadn't um, wasn't here 2 weeks ago for the part one of this, I I'm sure Don's got it out there someplace, already put out there someplace. But I am going to do a little bit of quick review. So this part two is entitled "The Book of Ezekiel." I'm going to look a little bit in Exodus, in the Gospels, and the Acts, and some miscellaneous items. Um, Again, kind of connecting uh, the Qumran community, uh, the Zadok priesthood, which was kind of what part one was about, history of the Zadok priesthood. And I'm going to kind of really quickly go through some of the slides, just kind of give those who weren't there last 2 weeks ago, or maybe just to kind of refresh people's memory what was happening here. So what I looked at was some of the history of the Zadok priesthood. And I talked here, especially, this was kind of the key verse where from the title was where Messiah was speaking with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, and they were asking him to tell us by what authority he does these things, and he kind of turns the tables on them and says, "Okay, before I answer you, uh, what the baptism of John, was that from heaven or from men?" So he was answering a question with a question, and kind of turning the tables in the sense of basically by what authority was John doing what he was doing. And we kind of explored the reasons why that was the Messiah's counter to this. And we talked a little bit about that. I also went into Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 46 to begin. This is in the section of Ezekiel that most, I don't say most, a lot of Christians and evangelicals and others believe that this is talking about from chapters 40 to 46, I believe it is, maybe 48, is talking about a millennial temple. And it's talking about sacrifices, and it's talking about the sons of Zadok, who will be the ones ministering to him. We see this also in Ezekiel 44. And we talked a little bit about uh, uh, the sons of Zadok here again. They would be the ones there. And that if there was any controversy, that they would be the ones that would stand in judgment. And because he was directing them to that. And so we kind of explored then, well, where'd that come from? And it came from out of Deuteronomy, where he gave that initially to the Levites, to the Aaronic priests, and then we kind of explored, as I talked about, we kind of explored uh, where did we get the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, to come down through Aaron and through his sons, Eleazar, Nadab, and Abihu, and Ithamar. And we talked about the background to all of those. We also talked a little bit about the Korah and them challenging, uh, both Moses and Aaron. We met also discussed a little bit about Pincus or Phineas, as he's called. And one of the things there that came out is that because of what Phineas had done, who he was the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, that Yahweh told him that I would give him a covenant of peace, but I would also give him an everlasting priesthood. So what we're going to see then is this coming to light as we continue on. I went down and looked through some more of the history. We talked about how Eli and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they were cut off. And then further on descended Abiathar challenged. He supported Adonijah as king, and because of his support of him, got cut off. So of all of all of Aaron's original sons, the lines of them were cut off except for Zadok. Zadok was the last of those, was the last line, and so that's where we get to the sons of Zadok. Um, I went through and talked about the priestly lineage, then starting with Aaron and going all the way down near the top of the second column. You see. So what are you seeing right now?
I'm seeing what we're supposed to see.
Okay, let's go from there then.
All right.
Okay, sorry for the technical difficulties. It's probably more the operator than anything.
No, it's acting weird on my end. It won't open.
Anyways, as I was mentioning, we last week I did want to look at, just kind of cover a little bit. Um, we talked about the verses in Luke that were kind of the title by what authority, and we also talked about in Ezekiel how that about the sons of Zadok, and about this being thought as being part of the verses that relate to the millennial temple. We went through and looked at Eleazar, or son of Eleazar, Phineas, how Yah gave him a covenant of peace and also a covenant of an everlasting priesthood. We then looked at how we got to the fact that there's just the sons of Zadok, with the other uh, lineages of Aaron from both Nadab and Abihu, and also um, Ithamar. Their lines were all, uh, you know, various things happening with them and being done. So we also looked at the lines here of the priest. As I think that's about where we left off. Was Jehozadak was the priest that went into captivity in Babylon, and then when they returned is Joshua or Yeshua. And then it goes down to Onias the third, and Onias the third was interesting because he was the last um, of the continuous Zadok line. Now there were some others that acted as priests later, but at the time he was the last of that line, and it kind of okay. Now I'm not getting. Let me see this. Uh, Continued through the line then from Onias the third. He was cut off. He was forced out here. And so then we have the line then of those who came in. We got Jason, eventually the Maccabees, and continuing on to the second column of the page 2 of the lineage. We went through and we see down towards the end of that, we get to Annas and eventually to Caiaphas, who was there at the time of Messiah's crucifixion. So, from the time of Onias the third, the priesthood was usurped, and so we kind of talked through a bunch of that, and then we talked also a little bit about the way and how that shows up in a lot of places, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Interestingly, with Paul, we talked about at the beginning, he went after those of the way, and then by Acts 24, he was a follower of the way. And the way is important because this is what the Qumran community described themselves. If you look in their writings, they didn't really call themselves Essenes. They wrote that they were the continuation or descendants out of the Zadok priesthood. They left. This Onias III I mentioned had been killed. A lot of them were being killed when the Greeks came in under Antiochus Epiphanes, and he changed the system, corrupted the temple, put in priests, and from that time forward, most of the priests were put in the office either by the Greeks and then later the Romans by bribery and intrigue of various types. So that continued, but the Qumran community, uh, which were the extension of the Zadoks, that was their thing. It was about the way, and so they did uh, uh, continue on with that. I went on down, kind of talk about the story of Hanukkah. Again, this is where Antiochus Epiphanes comes into place. Onias III was removed, and we get the whole story of Hanukkah with the Maccabees. And the Maccabees, after they got rid of the Greeks and rededicated the temple, the Maccabee leadership basically took over both as king and priest, which was not supposed to be the case. But there's a connection there a little bit with Onias, because that name Onias is the Greek version, and we'll talk about that in a second. Onias is the Greek version of the Hebrew Yohanan or John. So it's a lot is thought about. The reason that John was named what he was kind of to show the connection back from Zacharias and Yohanan. The thought is they were actually descendants in the Zadok priesthood as well. Um, and then we looked through some verses that talked about the naming of John, which I think is really important. This whole first chapter or two of John of the book of Luke is really interesting, talking about Zacharias and Elizabeth, and again why his name was John. Goes through this whole process. The angel actually came and told him that you will name him John. Why was that so important? And again, I think that's the connection there. It talks about here that in Luke 1, verse 80, that John the Baptist, the child grew and waxed strong in spirit and was in the desert in the Arava until the day of his showing or the day of his coming. There's some thought that that is when he turned 30 to be acting as a priest. So continuing on. So we went down through again all this, the connections with Yeshua. We see with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and on down to Annas and Caiaphas. And then the slide here just kind of shows the system from the Maccabees on down. We get to where we get to the Boethesians and the Sadducees, and we get to the Pharisees and their thing, and we eventually get down to what we had. So these were the ones who were taking over, the Sadducees especially, were taking over the priesthood duties. The Pharisees were the ones that looked had a lot to do with the synagogue system outside of Jerusalem, but the Sadducees are the ones that were primarily doing the priesthood. We talked a little bit about Qumran again because this is the connection. It's located, is found near an ancient town known as Beth Abara or Bet Abara. And Qumran's kind of on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. And even some of the old maps I showed here talks about these things were done. This is when John was baptizing, was done at Beth Abara. And we also talked a little bit about John, why he was baptizing. The date that the Pharisees and them came and asked him why he was doing the things he was doing, and basically by what authority. And again, this was happening at Bethabara beyond Jordan. And we talked a little bit through all of that. One of the things that the Qumran community, one of their key verses, if you were going to identify them or how they identified themselves, was again this Isaiah 40 verses 1 through 3. This was their kind of main verses that they talked. Comfort you, my people, says Elohim. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem and cry unto her the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness. Of course, we know that's John the Baptist, is how he described himself. Prepare ye the way of Yahweh. So the way. So when the Zadoks left out of Jerusalem or kicked out, they settled in this one of the areas they settled primarily, developed their community there, and that was what their focus was on preparing the way of for Yahweh, because they believed that his coming was imminent soon. Um, so talked a little bit about the main sects of Judaism, Sadducees, Pharisees, and again, what Josephus and them, Philo and Pliny the Elder, they all talked to them about as Essenes, but these were the ones at the Qumran community. And a lot of, you'll see nowadays, historians and those have referred to them the Essenes, but the Qumran community folks never called themselves Essenes. They called themselves of the way or the Akkad of the one. So brought it back around full circle then back to whose authority. So this discussion between Yeshua and the Sadducees and Pharisees wasn't just about John and what, that they didn't believe in John. It was all about authority. It was all about what authority are you going to follow? And John's authority, they understood this back then. John had the authority of the priesthood. They were sitting in that position, especially the Sadducees, and that so they were usurping John's authority or the Zadok priesthood's authority, and so that's kind of where we got to this. And then I put up some sources that I have been working with. There's others, but these are kind of the main sources. And that's kind of how I ended things last time. So now in part two, I want to continue with that as the basis. I want to talk a little bit more about the Zadoks and where do we see that, or do we see that other places? And so I'm going to both about the Zadok, the priesthood, but also where do we see the I told you last time we didn't really want to get into a calendar discussion per se, but in this part I'm not going to be able to avoid that. I do want to just say right off that this is just still stuff in a research mode for me, and I'm hoping to kind of maybe to provoke some of you to look into this as well. I'm not moved over to the Zadok calendar yet or anything like that. I've been researching into it. I find there's a lot of interesting things involved with it, and I will try to present some of that with you tonight. I am also going to look at the background in Ezekiel. We'll look at some in the Gospels and the book of Acts, and we will, like I say, we'll look at some calendar issues and that priestly calendar. So it's kind of been dubbed the Zadok priestly calendar, but obviously it was in existence a lot longer before Zadok the priest at the time of David. It existed prior to that. So those are kind of some of the things we'll look at tonight, and I've got some other um, miscellaneous things I want to look at as well. So let's get going. I went to Ezekiel to begin with, as I mentioned. A lot of the people in Christianity, evangelicals and others, and perhaps some of you as well, think these chapters in Ezekiel from 40 to 48, these have to do with uh, the millennial temple, the millennial priests being the sons of Zadok, and that they would be administering controversy, as we talked about last time. And so it's looked at as that by many of the Christians, but is that truly the case? So I want to do to begin with here is to take a little closer look at Ezekiel. So Ezekiel, first of all, we know he is a prophet, but he was a priest, right? So he was in the priestly line. Um, he was amongst the very first captives taken to Babylon in approximately 597 BCE. Uh, and the temple was eventually was destroyed about 10 years later, 587, 586 BC. The dates here are somewhat, not exact, but there's a lot of controversy over the dates exactly. So I'm just kind of giving you ballpark numbers here. Ezekiel's contemporaries, Jeremiah prior to him, and then Daniel was also with him, was in captivity also in Babylon. But also Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Nahum were also writing at various times, kind of contemporaneous to Ezekiel. Ezekiel's message to Judah during the exile. So he was part of Judah that was exiled, and he had themes of that Yah had given him in visions and things, judgments, repentance, and a promise of restoration. Um, but what's interesting, and I think a lot of people overlooked, is that Ezekiel also did meet and had messages to the northern 10 tribes of Israel, who had gone into captivity roughly 721 BC, so about 125 years plus or minus a little. And he met with the leadership of the northern tribes of Israel while in captivity in Babylon. So I'm not, I think, I'm sure some of you Bible students that are, right there are aware of this, but I think a lot of people may not be aware of this. Um, so that's kind of just some background with him. One of the things to understand here is that Ezekiel was a great prophecy, has a lot of great prophecies, but the book, what we call the book of Ezekiel, is actually made up of individual scrolls. And there's actually 13 different scrolls that are that make up what we call the book of Ezekiel. And each of these scrolls are time date stamped. And we'll see this as we kind of go through this. But we know in Ezekiel there was a lot of prophecies he was given. He had the temple vision. He had the vision about the wheel inside of the wheel going, and the one like Son of Man. He had the whole message about him having to lay on his left side and right side, both for the house of Israel and house of Judah. He did meet again because he was in the captivity with the group of Judah. He did meet with them. He had the vision about him digging a hole in the wall. He had the vision of the dry bones. He had the vision about the two sticks being held. He met with the elders of Israel, like I mentioned. So he had a lot of prophecies, and I think definitely some of these prophecies are for the end times. No doubt about that. But with a lot of prophecy, sometimes they're dual in idea, and that maybe it was something that was going on back then, but will also be something that will be fulfilled in the future. So one of the things I mentioned there is that Ezekiel's message, a lot of his prophecies was to both houses of Israel. The what we see in Ezekiel 4, I've got the scriptures here, but I'm not going to read through all of them. Where he's lying on both sides. That one side was for house of Israel, one side was for the house of Judah. Talked about how many years, for their sins. You see the prophecy about the dry bones, and we also see about the two sticks. So in all those cases, these are prophecies or messages to both houses of Israel. So he's giving these to both houses of Israel at that time. So again, Ezekiel's made up of 13 scrolls. And so what I've got here listed on your left-hand side are how they are currently numbered or how they are currently placed in the through the Masoretic text. So like in your King James and a lot of other versions, this is how you would see them. And notice, starting basically with I've got here verse 1 on through down to Ezekiel 40 through 48, which again is those verses talking about the temple and that type of thing. But why are the scrolls placed in this order? Because what we're going to see is they are not in chronological order. And this is important. So why are the scrolls placed in the current order that we see them in? Did Yah inspire this order? They certainly weren't in the order or the date stamps that were given to Ezekiel when he was given the visions and then wrote them down on these scrolls. That's not the order that Yah had given him to him, but it's possible he was inspired. These were inspired to be put in this order. Perhaps they were mistakenly placed in this order. I'm not really sure. Or there could be some influence, right? The Jews, the Pharisaical, even Catholics, about how they did the order of these for certain ulterior reasons, let's say. What we are going to see here next is looking at Ezekiel 1, verses 1 through 4. And so beginning in verse 1, it says, Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month. So as I mentioned, each of these visions, as he wrote them, had uh, a month, date, and year timestamp. And the year here we're talking about is the year of Jehoiakim's. You see this in verse 2, his captivity, and that's what it's connecting to. So it's interesting that verse 1 starts in the 30th year, but then we move down to verse 2, and it says, In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of Jehoiakim's captivity, the word of Yahweh came expressly to Ezekiel the priest. What I wanted to point out there is that this seems to be like an added verse in not initially in the context because it's written in the third person. It says here that the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest. It's not how verse 1 is and how verse 4 is. So verse 2 and 3 are kind of in that third person context. And what is believed by this, and this is not something new, let me tell you, there's a lot of people have researched this way back into the 1800s even about this whole thing about the ordering of these scrolls. And this in particular is kind of throws people off a little bit because verse 2 and 3 are in a third person view. So if you read verse 1, now it came to pass in the 30th year in the 4th month and the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives in the river Shebar, that the heavens were open and I saw visions of Elohim. And then jump down to verse 4, and I looked and behold a whirlwind. So those kind of connect right together. This seems to be an insertion, verses 2 and 3. And it's what his thought is this was maybe a scribal tag that was put onto the scroll and then somehow later got translated and was put into it. So this kind of gives you one of the things that you have to look to pass. And to kind of give you an idea here, to show a little bit of the proof of the reordering of these. So as I mentioned, Ezekiel verses 1 and 2 talks here, and it came to pass in the 30th year in the 4th month, the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives in the river. And then it says, in the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of Jehoiakim's captivity. So verse 1 is talking about the 30th year, but verse 2 is talking about the 5th year. So you can kind of see this mix. looking down to the next verse is Ezekiel 4. This is the Ezekiel 4 is where it's the whole where Ezekiel's commanded to lay on each of his sides for the different for the years of iniquity of Israel and of Judah. And then we get to Ezekiel 8. And Ezekiel 8, in the way they're lined out now, is the next time date stamp that we see. So it's the 6th year, the 6th month, and the 5th day of the month. So the 6th year, so um, uh, we notice up in the verse 2 there, it says it's the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year. So we got the 5th year, and then in chapter 8, it goes into the 6th year. And again, the slides will be out there. You can take a look at these. I don't want to get into a whole bunch of detail, but if these were in the proper order, Ezekiel 1 and 2, and then Ezekiel 4, these would have all been under the same stamp uh, prophecy or timing that was given. So if we look at this in Ezekiel 4, there's 4 and 6, if this was given on or about the 5th day of the 5th year, and then we see in Ezekiel 8, it's now the 6th month of the 6th year, 5th day of the month, you're really looking at almost exactly um, 14 months difference between the two. So if we look at, a lot of the teachers and scholars will actually, if you look at some translations, will actually use the month and day translation to put into verse 2 from verse 1. And so they end up with 455 to 656. So again, 14 months would be the difference between that. The problem with that is that the prophecy in Ezekiel 4, Ezekiel was lay on his side for a total of 430 days, 430 days total. But then when we get to chapter 8, he is sitting up in his house, uh, would have been approximately 420 days. Okay. Or as some look at it, 415 days, maybe is not 400, depending on what calendar you go by, how the Jews calculate it. But he was instructed to lay for a total of 430 days. And yet we see that at around 420 days, he's up in the house, uh, sitting and meeting with leadership. So we have to either surmise that he disobeyed Yah, which I don't think is the case, or that the scrolls were not in the correct order. And so that this is kind of what leads to why I'm saying that. This is just one proof that you can kind of talk about. And I guess it's a little bit complicated with the math and everything, but if you want to, you'll look at the slides, you can kind of study through it. We have here a diagram that kind of shows the timing of the scrolls. And if you'll notice, the first scroll is actually Ezekiel 8 in terms of the time mark of it. The second scroll is in Ezekiel 20. So you can see that the order of them are not in the correct order. And we get down to like the 11th scroll is Ezekiel 40 to 48, which people think as the millennial kingdom and the temple and all of that. So the scrolls are not in the right order. And so I've kind of placed here in a little easier diagram, maybe C, maybe it's a little bit small for you to look at, but maybe you can look at it later, kind of putting them in the correct order. Again, this whole anomaly with Ezekiel 1 verses 2 and 3 they think is not affixed by Ezekiel. It was in third person, and it was probably a scribal tab that was written in third person. So removing that, again, the first scroll would have been Ezekiel 8 to 19. And then you can kind of keep going down. So you look at them, he's uh, present with the state of Israel. He's talking to them. He's talking about their abominations. And then the next scroll, he's talking about the rebellions of both Israel and Judah and Jerusalem and opportunity for restoration. Um, Talks about proclamations against surrounding territories is the next. The fourth scroll is a proclamation against Egypt. The next one, 5, is against Tyre, and this is, of course, where we get the prophecy. It's first talking about Tyre, and then it's talking about the king, which would be Satan. So we're familiar with that prophecy. So again, some of these prophecies I think are in time, obviously, but some of them may be something different, and I'll talk about that. Next, you get a proclamation against Pharaoh. In the next one in 7, it's a proclamation about Egypt, as is the eighth scroll. The ninth scroll was a lamentation for Egypt. The 10th scroll talks about fall of Jerusalem and kind of a prophetic aspect. And then the 11th scroll, we get to the what we would a lot of people would look at as being the millennial temple and the priesthood and things there. But as you look through this as a different view of this, you know, the thought is here is Ezekiel is giving a provisional constitution, another, a renewed temple, uh, a conditional offer for national restoration, both houses coming together. And this would have been of an interim constitution until the time of Reformation that the seed would come. So, kind of a little different view about that. And then we get to the 12th scroll about Babylon will plunder Egypt. And then in the 13th scroll, which is Ezekiel 1 all the way through 7, talks about a priestly commission of judgment because Israel rejected the constitution set forth. So again, this is kind of a different look at this. I understand that. So again, we looked at this whole thing about the different roles and about Ezekiel's messages. So again, just for something for you to take a look at, I've put in here some of the verses, like in Ezekiel 14, where it talks about certain elders of Israel came and sat before me. So again, just I'm kind of supporting this idea that it wasn't, even though Ezekiel was taken as part of the kingdom of Judah going into captivity, he also was meeting with leadership from the northern 10 tribes. And so Ezekiel 14 is one place that talks about that. Ezekiel 17, where he's speaking a parable to them. Ezekiel 20, again, meeting with the elders of Israel. So he had opportunity while they're in captivity to meet with the leadership of the Northern 10 tribe and believe tried to convince about, repenting, turning back so that they could have a reunified kingdom. And that's what Yah wanted for them, just to return back to him. Now, again, Ezekiel scrolls contain a lot of prophecies. I guess the question, are the prophecies in Ezekiel 40 to 48 regarding a millennial temple, or is it instead part of a conditional offer of national restoration? Ezekiel 40 to 48 also speaks of the priesthood, again, the sons of Zadok, Levites, and it also speaks about offerings and sacrifices. And in my past, I always wondered about, well, why would why would Yah want in the millennium for us to go back to, or for some people to go back to doing offerings and sacrifices? And so, kind of thinking about that, if Messiah is already the Melchizedek priesthood, why would there be a need for a Levitical Zadok priesthood in the future, in the millennium? And so we also have the verses that talk about us, that we're a chosen priesthood, a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. Revelation talks about us being kings and priests in verse 1, again in verse 5. that we're going to be kings and priests. Again, in 20 verse 6, that we will reign with him 1,000 years, and will be priests of the Most High. And so if the question would be then, what priesthood are we to be a part of? Of a Levitical Zadok priesthood or the Melchizedek priesthood under Messiah? So the obvious probably answer to that is yeah, we're supposed to be part, following of Messiah, part of a Melchizedek priesthood under him. He's obviously the high priest, but we would be serving under that administration. It also talks about, that in Numbers we talked here about Phineas, about that he was given an everlasting covenant of peace and an everlasting priesthood. We also see this in Jeremiah 33, where neither shall the priests, the Levites, want for a man before me to offer burnt offerings and to kindle meat offerings and to do sacrifices continually. So the question then becomes is how do we square? How is the everlasting priesthood of Zadok of Phineas fulfilled? And how is that priesthood connected with the Melchizedek priesthood? Because you can't have two priesthoods serving. And so if Ezekiel 40 through 48 is talking about a millennial temple with a millennial priesthood, how do we square those two? And so, that's something I'm going to leave to you all to think about a little bit. It also talks about there being sacrifices. And so my question is, why would there be a need for sacrifices in the millennium when Messiah has already paid the price and there's no more need for sacrifices? And one verse I put down, there's others there in Hebrews where it talks about he did this once and for all. He offered himself up. So kind of looking at this, does contain many prophecies, many into the future, but I hope I brought to your attention that the 13 scrolls of Ezekiel are not chronological order, and Ezekiel's visions are warnings and perhaps more as an offer by Yah for both houses for reunification. And of course, we know that didn't happen. So I'll leave this to you to study into and research further and to explore. So now I want to take a look here at the Qumran community, the Zadok priesthood in the Gospels and the book of Acts. Before I do that, I want to get into, I talked a little bit about the calendar and stuff last time. One of the things that I've had trouble with under the traditional Hillel calendar is I do not see any place in Scripture that it shows that a 13th month. And I've given here a list of items that show 12 months, right? We know about the 12 months. There's 12 major constellations. Those are kind of connected with each of the months, connected to the 12 tribes. We see, again, in Revelation chapter 22, that at the end, there's going to be 12 fruits from the tree of life that yielding fruit for each month, right? So there it talks about 12 months because there's 12 kinds of fruit. First Kings talks about the governors, the 12 governors Israel. Each one made a provision for the king's table for 1 month of the year. So again, 12. In First Chronicles, it talks about David's army were organized according to a 12-month cycle, right? So again, these things all point to 12 months and not 13. And I haven't seen any direct evidence in Scripture about a 13th month. The picture up in the upper left corner is actually a floor in some of the ancient synagogues in Israel and other places where they actually had this as like mosaic tiles into the floor, in the flooring of the synagogue, where it had the 12 major constellations, or the Mazaroth, as it's called in the Hebrew. And so they understood this connection with the 12 months and not a 13th month. So that's one of the pieces that I always struggled with, as to why would we have a calendar that would have a 13th month, when it seems like in scripture I don't see any evidence of that. And again, I'm studying into this. If people have got ideas about that, we can talk afterwards. Um, I also showed this uh, chart last time. It's a comparison between the Greek and Babylonian calendars, as well as the Hebrew, the Hebrew calendar, the pre-Babylonian Hebrew calendar. And my question here is if we are following after the Hillel calendar, why would we keep a calendar with Babylonian names when we're supposed to be coming out of Babylon? So, and the whole idea, again, this pre-Babylonian calendar didn't have a 13th month, but we know under the current Babylonian Hebrew, modern Hebrew, they do have a 13th month every 3-4 years. So again, just some things to look at. One final thing to just think about here in terms of the Zadok calendar is the postponement rules that the rabbis put in under their calendar. Uh, so there's these postponement rules. And for instance, unleavened bread uh, under the rabbinic calendar, Hillel calendar, can never fall on a Wednesday. And Yom Teruah, trumpets, could never be on a Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday. And Yom Kippur could never be on a Friday. But what we see in the Zadok calendar, and what you're going to see here, is that these dates are always on these days of the week. So unleavened bread is always on the fourth day of the week, which we would look at as Wednesday. Yom Teruah on the Zadok calendar is always on the fourth day of the week, on Wednesday. And Yom Kippur is always on the sixth day of the week, on a Friday. Now, one of the reasons that is cited for the postponement rules, um, and why, is because they explain in part is so that we don't end up with double Sabbaths. So like if atonement's on a Friday, and then the Sabbath you're not supposed to be preparing food, and you couldn't have done it on Friday because of Yom Kippur, then that's the case. But I guess I would ask, if Yah established it that way, would we keep it? Why wouldn't we keep it? So just again, these are just questions that I've been working through as I'm trying to study into this. Uh, why would the Hillel rabbinic calendar specifically cite these postponement rules, uh, so that it didn't fall on what the Zadok priestly calendar had? Is there a connection there? And I think it is, because I kind of think maybe that the rabbis were trying to silence the Zadok priests, again, because the Pharisees and Sadducees had taken over, and the Zadok priests were kicked out, and they overtook the temple from them. So they were trying to, again, establish their authority away from what the Zadok priests were doing. I did want to just, again, talk a little bit about the calendar. Again, this is meant to be all about calendar issues, and I know everybody gets tired of so many variations and things, but I just want to give you a little background on the Zadok priestly calendar. And again, it's called that due to the Zadoks living at Qumran, but this would be arguably a calendar that would be back to Moses and even before. And we'll look at a section of scripture out of Torah that actually confirms this calendar. So a couple of the things to know about this: this is a 364 day calendar. So it's 12 30-day months, plus they add the two equinoxes and the two solstice days, one for each quarter. So it goes like 30 days, 30 days, 30 days, and then 30 days, 30 days, 30 days, and another one. So at the end of things, you get to 364. And so that's the way the calendar is set up. The year always begins on the fourth day or on our Wednesday of the week after the spring equinox. So, so what's the rationale for that? So it kind of goes back to creation week because the sun, moon, and stars was created on the fourth day of creation. So what they did was is that the year always began on Wednesday or on the fourth day after the spring equinox. Um, I haven't I think it's after the spring equinox. I've looked at some stuff that says, well, if the fourth day is the spring equinox, then that would be the first day. But I'm not 100% positive about that. But I'm again kind of researching into that. So what's called here the Zadok priestly calendar is also some people think is the Enoch calendar. There are connections to these two. There are a lot of similarities, but there are also some differences. So again, just kind of going through what this was in Qumran and what the Zadok priestly calendar looked like. The weekly Sabbath stays intact. It's based on the Genesis creation week. So what happens in terms of this calendar and what happens with it, uh, it doesn't affect the Sabbath. It's always the week is always 7 days. Yeah, it stays intact because that's connected back to Genesis creation week. And each day of the year falls on the same date and the same day of the week, including the Sabbaths and the holy days. So, for instance, if and I know it's kind of small, but if you look in the first month in the upper left corner, Passover always falls on day 3 of the week on the 14th. It always falls on that. The in the first month there, you've got the Sabbaths are always on those days, those dates of the first month. And so that's one of the things that is different that we're not used to is that this calendar stays the same. So you know that a given date is always going to fall on the same day of the week, no matter what going forward. So let's take a look at that in the context of the Gospels in the Book of Acts, and I want to start with Passover. I know last week or 2 weeks ago somebody mentioned to me, well, there didn't really seem to be any contention between Messiah and what was being done at the temple in terms of the calendar issues, the days that uh, that the holy days were being kept on. So I found this chart online. I kind of use this because this is the chronology that many of us have adopted, or many people have adopted. There's variations. Some think a Thursday crucifixion instead of a Wednesday crucifixion. But for the purposes of today, I want to use this because I think for many believe this is, especially those who came out of a Church of God background, probably connects well with what was taught at the time. And so we see here about Yeshua, keeping the meal with his disciples, being arrested in the night. He was crucified at 9 a.m. As you go across this, he's died around 3. He was placed in the tomb just before sunset. And then when you looked at the whole thing of 3 days and 3 nights, would have resurrected prior to sunset on the weekly Sabbath. So again, this I think is a lot of, I wouldn't say all of you believe this exact. I know there's a lot of variations out there, but just kind of as a look at uh, what a lot of people believe. Well, I'm looking here now at the first month in the Zadok calendar. First month was called Aviv. Um, And this is what was being taught in the Qumran community by the Zadok priests. So as I mentioned earlier, that the beginning of the year, the first day of the year, always falls on the fourth day of the week, which was like what we would call our Wednesday. So if you go 14 days, you come to Passover. Passover always falls on the third day of the week, uh, which we would call as Tuesday, right? And and then you have the days of unleavened bread following that. So this again is just what this Qumran communities, is the calendar that they were using. And next, I'm showing you here a diagram. I know it's kind of busy and a little bit small, maybe to see everything, but what's shown here, highlighted in red, is what's called the Essene quarter of first century Jerusalem. And down in the lower right corner, you can see archaeological digs is where the Essene gates going in to that area. Now, we talked about if these are the descendants kind of the Zadok priestly line, how are they now in Jerusalem? And of course, this is at the time of the Romans. And we're going to understand here in a little bit. I'm going to cover some stuff about why they were a little bit more accepted, at least into Jerusalem, into the city and things, although they didn't ever really hold the title or the position of high priest ever again. But we see that they were accepted into the community, and that has to do actually with Herod, and I'll cover why the reason that is. So again, here's the Essene quarter is called, or those from the Qumran community, and the gate that enters into that. So this is a diagram of first century Jerusalem. This is another site, another kind of map of that, kind of rotated 90 degrees. So from what that other one was, you see where the Essene gate is in the red. What is believed to be the site of the Last Supper, you can see there marked in blue. And then, of course, we know the Garden of Gethsemane was across the Kidron Valley over onto the side of the Mount of Olives. And I've got that marked in green. So when we think about Passover and what Messiah kept as far as the Passover was concerned, and this whole idea of there being a quarter of the city and where the Last Supper may have been held, we go to a verse in Mark chapter 14, verses 13 to 16. And I'll read it there. It says, and he sent forth two of his disciples. And this is because it talked about where are we going to prepare for the Passover. And so he sends them in and go into the city, and you shall meet a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him, and whatsoever he shall go, say to the good man of the house, the master saith, where is the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And you shall show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. And there make ready for us. And the disciples went forth and came to the city and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. So why this sticks out a little bit is because in the cultural realm, why would a man with a water jug be remarkable? Why would that stand out? Because in first century Judea, drawing household water was ordinarily a woman's work. And we know that from the woman at the well, where Jacob's well. We see other examples of that in Genesis and in First Samuel. So a lone man carrying a clay jar or a stone jar would kind of stood out, functioning, kind of identifiable as a marker. So this is where we think there's a possible Essene connection here, or Qumran connection, or the Zadok connection. Josephus notes that the Essene men, those from Qumran, performed their own domestic duties and fetched water for themselves And this is in the War of the Jews, book 2, and excavations around Jerusalem's southwestern ridge, which is the so-called Essene Quarter, have uncovered large ritual baths, mikvahs, and then a whole myriad of water storage vessels, consistent with kind of this communal thing that the Qumran folks would be doing. The idea that he would send them to someplace where the upper room would have been kept, so these folks would have been knowledgeable about the fact that this to keep the ritual purity, you might say, and it would solve the disciples' need to be free of leaven, free of contamination. And so this whole scenario explains both the male water carrier and the readily available large furnished upper room. So as I mentioned here, this was not ordinary. And I mentioned about the Jewish historian Josephus talking about this with the men of the Essenes. So I already kind of read through this a little bit, just to kind of have the verses there for you. Again, looking at the large upper room, if you visit Jerusalem today, you can go to this picture, to this place. This is what is called the large upper room in Jerusalem today. It's not obviously thought that this was actually the upper room. Probably destroyed originally, buildings destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, but they believe this is the location because they've actually found some archaeological information here around this building that showed that this is where they thought the building was. So again, this just kind of all adds to the idea about was Messiah actually keeping his Passover in connection with uh, the Zadok calendar. So again, we kind of think he wouldn't kept the Passover, the meal with his disciples that night, and then went out, and then the next day would have been Wednesday, and again, so following through the chronology. But was he perhaps actually keeping the Passover in accordance with the Zadok calendar? And we notice, as talked about in John, that it was the Jews' Passover. Later on, we see that in the whole description about Messiah being crucified and things. So there certainly was a difference there between the two. So just kind of putting forward some information, some of the research I did on this. Next, we wanted to take a look at Shavuot on Pentecost. And I'll go back here to that first month of the Zadok calendar. And you'll notice here that the first day of the count of the Omer is clear on down to the 26th of the month. So the beginning of that count always falls on the 26th day of the first month, always in the first day of the week. So again, on the Zadok calendar, the holy days and different days of the week always fall on the exact same day. So if we take a look at this, so as far as unleavened bread, and this is after unleavened bread's over, and if we compare that to the other calendars, let's take a look at that. So we know under the Hillel calendar, which is kind of the Pharisees' calendar, they always began the count the day after the first holy day of unleavened bread. So that would have been always on the 16th of Aviv. Those in the Sadducees and the Samaritans always kept it on the Sunday during the days of unleavened bread. So you see here in this scenario, the Sadducees would have been keeping it on the Sunday, the first day of the week, the 19th, according to this calendar. and that's when they would have been keeping it. But the Zadok count would have began the next Sunday, always on the 26th would have been the first day of the count. So that's just how it works out. So when we get to Shavuot, we see that the Pharisee Shavuot, fell. Usually, a lot of any of you who keep that always know that it's either the fifth, sixth, or seventh day, depending on how many 30 days and 29-day months there is. The Sadducees, their Shavuot would have come that next Sunday, and the Zadok uh, Shavuot would have come the next day. So when we get to Acts chapter 2, it says, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all in one place in one accord. So each sect of Judaism, Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Zadok priests, the Essenes, you might say, or the Qumran, counted to Shavuot beginning on a different day, and therefore Shavuot occurred on a different day. Arguably, Shavuot had not fully come until the Zadoks kept theirs. Because under the Zadok calendar, Shavuot always falls on the 15th day of the third month, which is always the first day of the week. So again, this is just some of the information kind of looking at the whole idea of the different calendars and how perhaps we're seeing where the Zadok calendar was actually being used at the time. What we see in both the Gospels and the Book of Acts. I have one quick verse in Sukkot, and I will tell you I think there's some speculation to this, and you'll see it right away when I go into this. In John chapter 7, right, we have about where Messiah ends up going up to the Feast of Tabernacles. And as we read this verse, it says, now the Jews Feast of Tabernacles knows that. So it was at hand. His brethren therefore said unto him, depart hence and go to Judea, that the disciples also may see the works that thou doest. For there is no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself to the world. For neither did his brethren believe in him. And then Yeshua said to them, my time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. Always ready is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but he hates me because I testify of it, that the works thereof are evil. Go you up to this feast. So he's saying, you go ahead and go up to this feast, but I will not yet onto this feast, for my time is not yet fully come. And when these words have been done, he abode still in Galilee. But when his brethren were gone up, then he also went up to the feast, but not openly, but as it were in secretly. And then we notice in verse 14, now about the midst of the feast, again, the Jews' feast, this is when Yeshua went up to the temple and taught. So again, I realize this is maybe a little on the speculative side, but I'm just pointing this out. Is there a connection here that what the Jews' feast or the Pharisaical feast, the Hillel, was what was beginning, but he didn't go up until about partway through because he was perhaps keeping the Zadok calendar, and that feast day would have come on a different day. Again, just some things that I've looked into and wanted to point out. I do want to take a moment here. So some may be thinking, well, okay, is this calendar, this whole idea, does this show up in Torah? And I do, even prior to there being Zadok priests, just to the priests, to the Israelites themselves. And I do want to take a look at this. I want to look at Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 7. And it says here, and they took the journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came into the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month. So remember that date because, as we've discussed already, on what's called the Zadok calendar, the days of the year of each month fall on the same day on the same time every year. So in the 15th day of the second month, after departing out of the land of Egypt, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, would to Elohim we had died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and we did eat bread to our full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then said Yahweh to Moses, behold, I will rain down bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, and that I might prove to them whether they will walk in my law or not. And it will come to pass that on the sixth day they shall prepare that they bring it in, and it shall be twice as much as they shall gather daily. And Moses and Aaron said to the children of Israel, at even you shall know that Yahweh brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of Yahweh, for you will hear of your murmurings against Yahweh. And there, and what are we that you murmur against us? So again, this is this whole thing about Exodus chapter 16, talking about when the children of Israel came into the wilderness of sin, talking about this, about the second month and the 15th day of the month. So looking at the Zadok calendar, again, you notice here they've got in about the second Passover, and notice the second month, the 15th day of the month. That's a Friday, right? And so says as they took their journey from Elim, says on the 15th day of the second month. So I put a red X there. We see the 15th day of the second month after leaving out of Egypt. And it says, and in the morning, then you shall see the glory of Yahweh. So the next morning, right, they go and they see the glory of Yahweh because it was affirming. So that would have been on the Sabbath. His glory would have been known to them or been shown to them. It says, and then Yahweh says unto Moses, saying, in the morning you shall be filled with bread. And the children of Israel saw it, and they said to one another, what is it? Is manna, for they would not know what it was. And Moses said unto them, this is the bread which Yahweh has given you to eat. So we see his glory showed up on the 16th. It says, then in the morning you'll have bread. So that would have been on the 17th. So the 17th is on the first day of the week. You get to the 17th. So we see then they continued to gather manna each day. And when they, verse 22, it says, and on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much. So on the sixth day, which would have been a Friday, so we notice here the first day of the week through the sixth day of the week, 6 days, they had gathered, but they were supposed to be gathering a double portion on that day. So this is the first week of them getting manna. And then we have the Sabbath. Tomorrow is the rest of the Holy Sabbath. They weren't supposed to go out to gather, right? So the Sabbath is the 23rd, according to the Zadok calendar, the 23rd of the second month. So on the Zadok calendar, again, all the days are the same year to year. The 23rd day of the second month is always a Sabbath. The 23rd of the second month is never, on the 23rd of the second month is never a Sabbath on the Hillel calendar, on the Jewish calendar. And there's been research done on this 100 years in both directions. And never once under the Hillel calendar did they find that the 23rd fell on a Sabbath, the 23rd of the second month. Never fell on a Sabbath. But on the Zadok calendar, it always falls on the 23rd. So, and I'm using this to kind of demonstrate that this calendar was in existence prior till really even before the Zadoks were in office. But you know that under Israel, that Yah was still looking under Moses, looking at using in this calendar. It's the same. Um, so other a couple of other Qumran Zadok links in the New Testament. And I wanted to talk about this, and I mentioned earlier about the Essene or the Qumran quarter in Jerusalem, and we're going to look at how this probably came to be. I did want to just look at this for a minute. In the Qumran scrolls, lots of places I've got listed here, different places. There was this whole uh, back and forth about the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. And we see here a couple quotes, 1QM1, the first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness. Again, in 1QS1, again, this idea about there's a plethora of different places where this whole concept of the sons of light and sons of darkness are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Qumran community under the Zadok priesthood. But we're familiar with this kind of concept also in the New Testament. So in First Thessalonians, you were all sons of light and sons of the day. You're not of the night or of the darkness. And Messiah says in John 12, verse 36, while you have the light, believe in the light, so you may become sons of light. After the Yeshua had spoken these things, he went away and was hidden from them. Ephesians 5:8, for you were once in darkness, but now you are in the light in Yahweh. Walk as children of light. So again, these concepts that the Qumran community were teaching show up lots of times in the New Testament as well. This is where I wanted to get to as far as the Essene quarter and things. And we see this in Acts chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. This is now there were in the church that was in Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Menachem, which had been brought up with Herod, the tetrarch, and also Saul. And they ministered to Yahweh and fasted, and the Holy Spirit said, separate Barnabas and Paul for the work whereunto I have called them. And when they had fasted and prayed and laid their hands on them, they sent them away. So what's interesting here, as you read this, this was like a school of prophets and teachers. And these particular guys are listed. And this is very similar to what we see in the Old Testament. You know, when you look at Elijah and Elijah, they talks about the school of prophets and things. So this Menachem was one of those. Menachem was one of those. So looking at the Babylonian Talmud, which I know is one of those Jewish books and we don't necessarily follow, but what it's good for, like other books, is they have a lot of their history in there. So it talks here about this Menachem guy, and it talks about in the towards the end of that first paragraph that Hillel and Menachem did not disagree in regard to the issue. And if you remember back, in last presentation, I talked about the duality of under the Pharisees. You had Hillel, Menachem was there, but then eventually it turned into Hillel and Shammai. And that's because Shammai, you see in the second paragraph here, Shammai took the place of Menachem because he departed. And under the Jewish writings, it says, so where did Menachem go and depart to? And it says he departed and went astray. Well, yeah, he had this idea of the Messiah, and he went away from what the Pharisees were teaching that he had been a part of. And it says there in the Mishnah, did not wish to delve into the details of this case. Well, no, they didn't want to bring highlight to it. And then the last sentence here says, and they also taught in the Berita that Menachem departed for the king's service. Interesting phraseology there, with 80 pairs of students dressed in silk robes or white robes that the Essenes wore, So I think there's a connection there, and that they left him to work for the king, and they no longer studied Torah. Well, they no longer studied Torah the way the Pharisees taught it, with the oral Torah and all that. They left and returned to teach the way Yah wanted them to teach, the way the Zadok line wanted to be taught. So it's interesting this Menachem guy shows up in Book of Acts. This is some of the history behind it. And another piece of this is Josephus talks about this guy and kind of the connection there we're talked about in Acts that he had been raised with Herod. Um, so he was, says one of the Essenes, one of of this group. It says he had a testimony, but he not only conducted his life after an excellent manner, but he had the foreknowledge of future events. So he was a prophet, which kind of goes along with what we read in the book of Acts. And he once saw Herod when he was a child, and he says, however, you will be king. He says, so he's saying to Herod, you will become king. And at that time, Herod did not at all, attend to what Menachem meant. He didn't really understand what he was talking. Uh, but after a little while, he was advanced to being king. And, why his dominion, he sent for Menachem and asked him, well, how long shall I reign? And Menachem didn't really tell him the full length of his time, even though he asked, is it 10 years or more, 20 years, 30 years? He didn't really tell him how long, but then he gives him a warning. So this connection that Menachem apparently had with Herod, I think, has to do with why under the Roman rule, especially under Herod, they were somewhat more accepted, even into Jerusalem, where there was actually a quarter known as the Essene Quarter, because of these connections, and that Herod actually looked favorably upon them, as much as he could be like that, I suppose, because he was obviously a murderer and a lot of other things. But so just again, some connections here, looking in the New Testament and things. So I want to look at a few other miscellaneous things before we end. We know about the town of Bethany. We see that in Scripture a lot. In the Hebrew, it's known as Bet Ani, which means the house of affliction or the house of figs. And it's actually the little map I got there kind of shows you that it's across the Kidron, up over the Mount of Olives, and down on the backside of the Mount of Olives to the east. That's where the village went. And so we know this is pretty prominent in scriptures. There's a lot of significant events happened in Messiah's ministry there. Bethany was the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, or in his Hebrew name, Eleazar. Bethany was where the Messiah and his disciples often stayed while they were in the area in and around Jerusalem. Bethany is, of course, where Lazarus, Eleazar, was resurrected from the dead after being dead for 40 years or for 4 days. And I'll just say here, this is a picture. If you were to go to Israel nowadays, they actually have this as in Bethany as supposedly Lazarus's tomb. It's a place where you can actually go and visit there. Whether it's actually his tomb or not for sure, but it's obviously it's a small village. It's probably in close area, close proximity to that. Bethany was where the Messiah had dinner at Simon the leper's home. We remember that, right? And this is where the woman came in and poured the spikenard, had the expensive bottle of the spikenard and poured it on him. And you ever ask yourself, why would the Messiah and the disciples were sitting at a home of a leper, since a leper was not allowed to be in a village or a city? Was it that he was healed now, and this is just how they identified him, or was it something more to that? And one of the one of the thoughts to this, uh, in the Aramaic, it reads Simon the jar maker or Simon the potter. So in the Aramaic, the word for leper is garba, and then the word for jar maker or potter or clay maker is garaba. So would it make sense then that maybe this was not leper, but this was Simon the jar maker, and it kind of makes sense, as I mentioned, as Messiah is being anointed with a costly jar of perfume, and that same verse it's connected. Bethany is where the Messiah ascended back to heaven. This is something I just more or less recently, I would say in the last 6 to 8 months, kind of come across because in my mind, I always thought that uh, Messiah ascended when he went back to heaven from the Mount of Olives, because it talks there about the angel saying, well, likewise, when you see him return, and we know from prophecy that he's returning to the Mount of Olives, and Mount will split in two. But we see in Luke 24, verses 49 to 51, it says, behold, I send the promise of the Father upon you, but tarry you in Jerusalem until you are endued with the power from on high. And he led them out as far as Bethany. So see, he was leading the disciples out, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. And it came to pass, while he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into the heavens. So, so Bethany was a really important village for the Messiah during his ministry. A lot of key events happened there. And so one of the things I wanted to raise up here is that Bethany was associated being an Essene community. So yes, they had the Qumran community down by the Dead Sea, but Bethany was also thought to be an Essene community or a Zadok type priestly community, and with village there. And the scholars suggest that the Essenes occupied the area around Bethany during the first century. And this is just a writing from a professor in a book here that's talking about this, but this is also spoken about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Uh, Additionally, this is the site. The first century was thought to be the site where Yeshua and the disciples celebrated the Last Supper, but that's not the case, obviously. But additionally, Bethany is traditionally recognized as the home of Martha and Lazarus, and it kind of links it again to the Essene community. Not sure I'd hold a lot of weight in this because it talks about this is where they had the Last Supper, but that's not the case. But again, just some details in the book of Acts and the book of the and also in the New Testament where it talks about kind of connecting this whole idea of the Essenes. This little chart here, I know it's pretty hard for you to probably see. One of the things that's interesting, which is found in Qumran, was the Zadok priestly rotation. So we know because of David that there was 24 courses of priests, and in the year each of them would serve twice. So if you go 2 times 24, that's 48. Well, that still leaves 4 weeks of the year because there's 52 weeks in the year. So what we have is that some of them would serve as a third time in a given year, but the rotation never went out of order. The rotation continued going on. And what I did was highlight Abaya there, which we know was the course that Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, was of that course. And so that's always used as one of the markers about, when he served in the temple and he lost he lost the ability to speak, and then he went back, and then Elizabeth became pregnant. It's kind of connected to that. And in that sense, it also connects to was when Messiah was probably born, because that was 6 months later. So I wrote this and I highlighted the Abaya ones, and noting that rotates throughout the year. So Abaya serves twice, but we know there, and actually in 1 year it serves, I think serves 3 times. But so which one of these years during the 6 year rotation is what happened with Zechariah at the temple and the whole thing with John being born. So you kind of have to look and see when that possibly would have been. So I'm just showing this in here for an informational slide you could take a look at for your own edification. I just wanted to throw a couple other things up. These are just some last pieces that I want to talk about here. Nehemiah 10, verse 34 says, "And we cast the lots among the priests, the Levites, and the people for the wood offering to bring it into the house of our Elohim after the houses of our fathers at the appointed time year by year to burn upon the altar of Yahweh our Elohim as it is written in the law or in the Torah." So when you read this verse, I don't know if you've ever asked yourself, where is this recorded in Torah? Where is this command for this time of bringing in the offering, the wood offering? Where is this at? This is says it's appointed year by year. So one of the things is to bring in the wood offering. I've got a quote here or a cite here from the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q, that's the fourth cave, Q32 324D. There's a connection there you'll see about where it talks about the wood offerings. And the festival of the wood offering fell in the 6th month. And you'll notice there the first fruits of the new oil, and then you have the wood offerings going on. So the first fruits of the new oil, the wood offerings, where we know I've seen where it talks about the new oil and or the feast of the new oil. The wood offering is spoken about in the scripture. There's also scriptures that talk about the new wine. Well, we don't have any of those in Leviticus 23 listed, but apparently they understood this. They somehow understood that these things were supposed to be done. And on the Zadok calendar, those things are actually cited. And I wanted to go back to finally this calendar, which is interesting. The way this is set up in the Zadok calendar, you notice in the 3rd month, Shavuot, right? Now, from Shavuot, if you count 30 days, you get to the 5th month is the first fruits of new wine. So 50 days later, so we counted, from after the unleavened bread, you counted 50 days of the barley to we get to Shavuot is the wheat, right? 50 more days after that, you get to the first fruits of the new wine. And then you go on and you see then there's the first fruits of new oil and the wood offering being given there. And then that leads you into the fall holidays in the 7th month. So just kind of putting that out there. Again, this is just more informational stuff I've been studying into. I'm not ready to jump ship on our calendars at this point. I'm kind of really still studying this, and I'm hoping that I pique your interest somewhat so that, maybe there's some others that'll be studying into this. Maybe you'll prove it all wrong, and that would be fine too, because then I would know for sure. But I just wanted to put this out there, and it kind of all connects back to this whole idea where it starts, which is back to the idea about the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to the Messiah about whose authority. And in John, he connects this back to John. He says, well, by whose authority was he doing what he did? And so as I've tried to make this connection, it looks as though John was doing baptisms at or near where the Qumran community lived. He held to the same ideas about the way, and that he was preparing the way for Yahuwah to come. And so all of these things kind of make it connect together about whose authority. And calendar is one of those things, because the calendar, kind of looks at, were they going to follow the Zadok priests, or we're going to follow the Pharisees and Sadducees who followed after first the Greeks and then later the Romans, and they kept a different calendar system. Again, I appreciate you listening. I'll open it up now for comments and or questions. I'm sure there'll be at least some. Again, I'm not trying to push a calendar on anybody. I'm just trying to, I'm just trying to talk about what I've been studying into and where perhaps this would be, hopefully pique some interest for some of you as well. And with that, I will stop this and open it up for, look at there, Mr. Leach already has his hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, John.
Hang on a second, John. Okay, this is the point where we have question answer. Ask you everybody, please stay on topic. No sermons. 2 minutes limit, please.
There's a lot of topics here, I understand. So
So, and then if there is a difference that pops up, maybe we may have to agree to disagree. There's no sense killing each other over a topic like this. So, okay, you may now go, John.
Okay. Yeah, I just a little bit in confusion. You mentioned
join the crowd.
right. You mentioned there was no just 12 months, and we know right now that there's 8R2. But I think the Bible uses agricultural season to teach lessons. It starts with the barley and so on, and the lambs. And now, if you don't throw in 8R2, the Passover and the seasons would move. Pretty soon you'd have Passover in the middle of winter. Something like Ramadan, they don't put an extra month in, and Ramadan's always moving, sometimes in the summer and sometimes in the winter. So if you don't put in that 8R2, the agricultural seasons would be hard to use for a teaching lesson.
But you're starting from a basis of using the Hillel calendar, which only has 354 days, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you're going to have to add an extra month every 3 to 4 years to get it back in alignment. But under the Zadok calendar, you don't have that problem.
It's got more days?
It's got 364 days.
Okay. And I think and the way they get the days is by the moon. They come from the new moon all the time to start your month. And right now, that new moon comes on any day of the week. So how would that work? Is the new moon not relevant anymore to start a month? Like I know the Hillel now, it's off sometimes a day or two, but at a time when they were in the land or something, it appears like they sighted the moon, and that started the first day of the month. So, and that would be on different days. So I wonder how that worked. Maybe I'm not understanding your point.
Yeah. So under the Zadok calendar, in terms of starting the beginning of months, that wasn't used. So like again, the beginning of the first month was always the fourth day after the spring equinox. That
So
may or may not be a new moon.
Yeah, that's where I'm getting.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be using the moon anymore.
So one of the things in looking into this a little bit, and that's one of my areas that I'm still kind of trying to look at, is if you look at some of the teachings about that. So there's actually two words. There's the Kodesh, which is what we always talk about as new moon, but it's also, if you look in your Strongs or any of those, it'll say month. right? And so that's there. But then there is an actual word in the Hebrew for moon, and I think it's Yara or something like that.
Mhm.
And so that shows up the first time that actually shows up, like with new moon or whatever, shows up is like in the vision that Joseph has about his brothers and his mother and father, about the sun and the moon bowing down to him and all that. That's the first time that moon's actually used. The
Mhm.
rest of the time, it's the Chodesh. But so the point of that is that have we looked at that wrong? And if we go by Strong's, it's it always is going to make that connection between and with Chodesh meaning a moon or a month. It makes that connection. But if there's a separate word in Hebrew for moon, why would you then be using this other word? So basically, the point is uh, maybe we've not been seeing this right because we kind of been looking at it with the connection, like with Strong's and other writings, and of course, if you believe there's this conspiracy, you might say, between the Zadoks and the Jews at the time and their calendar issues, they would want people. They were connecting with what the Greeks had brought in under this other calendar, which was the Babylonian style calendar. Uh, and under that, they did follow the moons. That's not to say, even under the Zadok priesthood, that the moon didn't have its connection. So when you look at like Genesis 1 verse 14, it talks about the sun, the moon, the stars. There is a use for the moon, but perhaps it's just not the beginning of a month. So that's kind of just of a snapshot. You'd have to you can go out online and there's lots of places you can do some research to talk about, this idea that it's actually talking about two different things. But yeah, under the Zadok calendar, it has nothing to do with the moon. Uh, Not that the moon is still not important in terms of the year and things, but it's not used in terms of determining the beginning of months. Clear as mud, probably, right?
I'm done.
Mm.
Okay, thanks, John.
Yeah.
My question is, in in the Exodus, it talks. Moses says, "This for you," talking to the children of Israel, "is the beginning of months."
Yeah.
So you
Of
have
the
to I mean, any calendar. If that's the command, the point where they were talking, this for you is the beginning of months. That has to be the starting point, regardless whether you're doing
but,
one thing or the other. That's the command.
but do you
But
see
you have to
anything
figure
that
out when it
connecting?
is. When it is.
Right. And do you see anything, arguably, do you see anything in that verse or those verses that talks about a new moon? It doesn't. It just
Mm.
says, Yah says this is the beginning of your months for you. So
Right. And then,
again, I'm still keeping the game same calendar we've
right.
all,
No, and it
but
does
it
clearly
makes,
state in the verses before that the hail destroyed the barley because it was in head, and the flax because it was in bloom. So I mean, it makes it. It sets it. Okay, that's the spring. So it's obviously the spring. So I don't know. But yes, it does not say a new moon. It says it's beginning of months.
right, right.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts, ideas? Gloria.
Um, when you were talking about the large upper room furnished, that's actually, I did a brief study on that. And let's see, here it is. And the words in Greek there's three Greek words that are translated into large upper room furnished. And the place in Mark 14:15 and Luke 22:12, where it's talking about you'll find the upper room furnished, like you quoted. Um, that's the only time that those three words are used. And it's a different Greek word that's used in Matthew, Mark, and twice in Luke when it talks about those who desire or appreciate the upper room, the uppermost rooms at feasts. It's a completely different Greek word. And when they went into an upper room when Pentecost was come, that's another different Greek word, not the same as the upper room at feasts. And even the room and even the Greek word for furnished is different from the Greek word in Matthew 22:10, where the wedding was furnished with guests, and in and then the word furnished in 2 Timothy 3:17, where we're thoroughly furnished unto all good works. So that's a completely different Greek word. So I didn't know if you knew that large upper room furnished came from three specific Greek words and that it's only used in those two places in Mark and Luke. Wondering
Yeah,
what you thought of
it'd be
that.
interesting to see. I knew there were some variations, but I haven't really studied that really close. But it'd be interesting to see if the Greek there in these verses talking about the Passover, where it says, it was prepared, if that would have a connection with the idea of it being prepared in the sense of the manna had been taken out, that was a kosher, quote unquote kosher room for them to be able to keep the Passover at. If there's a connection there in the Greek, I don't know. I just based on what you were just saying, I wonder if there would be a connection there.
That would be interesting. One of the things that seemed to be an idea there as far as furnished was that they can also have it could be strawed as if it's getting ready for a lamb to be in that location.
Oh, that would be interesting. With the context of what the Passover is and Messiah being the Lamb of Elohim. So
And that was where they were going to keep the lamb that was going to be killed. It's an idea.
that's cool.
Bill,
Hi, everybody. Make a couple of observations. Study by Strong's is bogus. He's not a lexicon, a person dealing with the technologies of language. All he did was catalog words. He didn't use the prefixes, suffixes, types, or anything. It's a poor man's tool, and it's very, very, very inaccurate. So you cannot drive doctrine from Strong's. Not if you're a legitimate student. The other comment I wanted to make is there's no evidence found through all the decades of study I've done on the calendar that the Zadok calendar has anything to do with the Bible. In fact, the only thing that really matters when you boil it down to is what did Yeshua do for the calendar. All the rest of it doesn't really matter. He's the only perfect example. He's the only one that's sinless. He's the only one that got it right. So what was he doing? And as far as we can tell, all the evidence points that he was using the same calendar as they were in the temple. And that was the Sadducees. That's what the evidence presents. So those are the comments that I'd have to make. I don't know where you come up with all the rest of the stuff, but I don't find any evidence for it. Thank you.
That's certainly a position you could take. Yep.
John?
Yeah, I was puzzling about the wood offering. That got my interest, and of course, like everybody knows on this forum, I have to go to the old Hebrew that Septuagint copied, and and I'll just read it in Nehemiah, like it's in the later Masoretic Bible, which was completed in the 10th century, but AD. But the earlier one, well, here I'll read theirs. It says, "For the wood offering at times appointed, and for the first fruits, remember me." But it reads much different in the Old Hebrew. It says the offering of the wood bearers. It's an offering of people, a class of people that appears to me, was carrying wood, and that was their job, was at certain times, and the times of the first fruit. Instead of a wood offering, it's the offering of a group of people called the wood bearers. That's the way I read it anyway. If somebody's got it on their computer, they can go back and see the same thing. And that would kind of clear that up, why it's not in the appointed times. And another thing, Simon the leper, that struck my interest too. So I went to Thaler's dictionary, like Strong's is not, their strong point is not dictionary, but Thaler's a better dictionary. And it says that word for leper is scaly or rough. So this Simon, he might have had psoriasis, who knows? But,
Yeah.
or he maybe got beat up in his past life. Maybe he played hockey or something.
Just from Canada.
Yeah, maybe, but it don't necessarily mean leper. And like you rightly pointed out, if he was a leopard's house, if he was still existing as a leper, nobody be in the house, right? Or he
Right.
wouldn't even be. He wouldn't even be in the house. He'd be in
Right.
a different place. So
Yeah.
that might explain that. I don't know. It just sparked my interest when you brought that forth.
Yeah. Just there's a bunch of stuff like that that just kind of, as you're studying through different things, you kind of like, well, we read that all these years, and I don't know if you ever thought about that before, but struck me interesting. So
Well, sometimes like a word like pastor, every other time in that word is used, that Greek word in the New Testament, it's always a shepherd. And of course, King James, they wanted to fit it in with their religion, so they translated every other place as shepherd, but now that same word they make pastor.
yeah.
So and of course, a shepherd could be a lot of people, like anybody looking after people, old people or young people, or even a father and a family could be classified as a shepherd. So
Yeah.
it had a wide range. I'm done.
Thank you.
Alan?
Hey, John. Hey, I got one question for you to start out with. By whose authority did you give this message tonight?
All right. Well, again, I probably spent a little more time on that whole by whose authority thing in the first section. So if you didn't see it, you could go back and take a look at that as well. But I understand what your point is. Yeah.
Are you saying these things on your own authority? I was going to refer to a couple places. Sermon on the Mount, and at the end of Matthew 7, it says, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he spoke as one having authority, not like the scribes and Pharisees.
Right.
So his tone, his assertions, his preaching and teaching was authoritative, and they weren't used to that. They were
Well,
used they were
I
used
would-
to more wishy-washy, kind of like follow
yeah.
our traditions. You must come under the umbrella of our tradition.
Well, and to a lesser extent, I would say that's the same with John the Baptist. Obviously, Messiah was Messiah, and John was something less. But you know, he was out there preaching with authority that
Mm,
made the Pharisees and the Sadducees and then that came out to him kind of cowered off when he kind of attacked them, calling them vipers and snakes, and said you're not even following Yah and whatever. So yeah,
mm.
good point.
Yeah, and he taught with authority. I think in is it is it Luke 3 or where they came and they asked him, "What should we do?" And the tax collectors asked him, "What should we do?" He's
Right.
speaking with authority if the tax collector is asking for advice. And he said, "Don't take more than you ought to take. Take only the allotted amount," right? Because tax collectors could take an additional amount. Somebody explained to me a couple of weeks ago that to be a tax collector, you had to buy that position. You had to invest into it. And now you got to make your money back and collect taxes. So they would collect more than they were supposed to. And John the Baptist spoke with authority, saying, "Don't do that. Don't take more than you're supposed to take." And the other people also were asking him for advice. So yeah, he spoke with authority as well,
Yeah.
especially when he made comments about "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin." So he's talking with authority right there.
Well, and that's something I covered last time. It's like, you know, only the high priest had the ability to designate the Lamb of God, which had a very a meaning, especially looking towards Passover and stuff. He's the
Mhm.
one who designated who's the Lamb of God, so
Yeah. Now, did you in part one touch on Matthew 23?
I
First
did.
couple. You did?
I did. I
Okay.
talked a little bit about that. And we had some discussion at the end about that too. But one of the things I brought up was that if you've heard about the book of Matthew written in Hebrew,
Yeah, I've heard of it.
yeah. So in the Hebrew Matthew, it says there about, says do whatever they tell you, do whatever they tell you to do. In the Hebrew Matthew, it says do whatever he tells you to do, referring to Moses. So you're sitting
Okay.
in Moses' seat, do whatever. And we had some discussion afterwards that could really be if they're reading from Torah, then do what they tell you, but don't do after what they do after that because they don't follow it.
Hmm.
So we had a couple back and forth discussions about that at the end last time. So
Okay. Yeah, I just wondered because that kind of falls into what you're saying here
yeah,
about doing what they say because they have the seat of authority
yeah.
when he uses the word seat here. Um, so on Passover, on the last Passover, was Jesus Christ slain on the day of Passover that the Pharisees kept or the Sadducees kept?
Um, my proposition is that he kept his Passover in accordance with the Zadok calendar.
That's not what I asked.
I know. Well, I didn't cover what you're asking. So, well, under the Pharisees, they would have been, because I think it actually says, like in John, that they didn't want to go uh, to into the temple or into the house there with what's his name, the Roman procurator or whatever. Oh, what's his name? They didn't want to go in because they didn't want to make themselves unclean for the Passover. So, the way the Pharisees kept it, they would have been keeping it, uh, you know, so when the sun went down the day he was crucified, they would have been keeping their Passover meal that night, and then the next day, first day of unleavened bread, is how the Pharisees keep it.
Yeah.
The Sadducees would have been keeping it, I guess, at the beginning of the 14th, right? Is I think how they keep it. I haven't looked at that for years, so I can't tell you exactly. So
Yeah. Yeah. I only bring it up because of Christ would have been with all the symbolism that was involved there on his last Passover. You would think it would have been the correct day. If we say that Zadok is the correct day for the Passover, then we would have to say then that the Sadducees were on the right day that year.
that year at least,
Yeah.
because as you know, that with the Pharisees or Sadducees, that moves depending on which year it is.
Yeah.
But
But it gives credibility to what they were doing.
it, for that year, maybe they were on the right day.
Yeah. All right. Just something I throw out there, just food for thought.
All right.
Oh, one other thing. If the new moon is not relevant for knowing the beginning of months, then a man who was out in the field or who was in the wilderness could easily lose track if he didn't count every day and diligently mark it down, keep a 30-day month calendar. Then he could lose track 1 or 2 days very easily, and you could not know what day of the month you were in if you weren't in touch with civilization.
Well,
Or,
right.
or if you were in a place like Babylon or someplace far away where there was nobody keeping track of the Zadok calendar, you could easily not know by not keeping a communication with others that are staying true to that, right? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Okay, that's all I wanted to say. You did a lot of work putting that together. Thanks.
It's still, as I said last time, I've been studying into this for about a year and a half, 2 years now, and there's still so much information that, when you look at what's contained in these Dead Sea Scrolls and more and more that's coming out too. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I guess for me, the bottom line is you might be right technically on the day, but you also will be all by yourself, maybe. You end up you end up being correct, but you're isolated and alienated from the body who doesn't agree with you.
Well, I'm not switching to this yet. I'm just studying into
I
it.
know.
But there are larger groups that are now converting over to this.
Yeah, but many people have poured over and been persuaded to do something that completely alienates them from everybody else because they hung on to some tidbit out of the book of Enoch, and now they're keeping the Sabbath on Wednesday every week. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. And again, I understand exactly what you're saying, but at the same time, why would we keep a Hebrew calendar that has Babylonian names if we're supposed to come out of Babylon?
Yeah. Well, you have to give it some other name then. You name it the first month and the second month instead of.
Which is what you see prior to the, Judah going into captivity. There's only 2 or 3 of the months that are actually named. That chart I added on there. Aviv, obviously, in the first month, but typically it's just the first month, second month, third month.
But when you're dealing with the secular, you'd have to switch back over so that you can convey the information on your job or what on your next door neighbor. You don't want to tell your next door neighbor, "Hey, come on over on the third month. I'm having a party."
But
right,
it's only because we're not used to that.
I know.
When you go to Israel, for instance, they don't use, for the most part, I mean, some of them do, but a lot of them, they don't use Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They, first day, second day, third day, sixth day, and then Shabbat.
Yeah.
They don't use, what we would designate that way.
Yeah. My dad told me when I was a little kid that Thursday is Thor's day,
Yes.
the god Thor. And then he went on to name a couple other ones. Friday is Frega's day, something like that.
Yeah.
So each one being named for some pagan deity.
Deity. Yeah.
But there's two people waiting in line. I got to get off.
Oh, all right.
Gloria?
Thanks. Yeah, you guys are stealing my thunder. I was going to tell you about my daughter and how when she was little, she couldn't remember the order of the days of the week. So we went to the Jewish way of doing it of 1 day, 2 day, and so on. So we did that. One of the other things I did want to mention was when you guys were talking about the night Jesus was betrayed, that in John 13:29, it does say that some of the disciples thought that because Judas had the bag, that Jesus had said unto him, "Buy those things that we have need of against the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. So there's some indication there that when that night that he was betrayed was sometime before the feast. I just wanted to mention that verse as well. I'm done.
Before Passover or before the days of unleavened bread? So yeah,
Well,
that would be the question,
right. And yet, if see, how does it work if he was going to buy something against the feast? When would he have had time to do that?
Well, I think a lot of people, depending on how you calculate Passover, if you calculate it the way Worldwide and them did, the Passover was on the 14th day. They'd keep it on the beginning of the 14th, but the daylight part of the 14th it's not like a Sabbath or anything. So people would still go out. So you would go out and then the feast, the first day of the feast would come then that next night, the beginning of the first day. So they would have the daylight time to go prepare to buy for the feast. I'm not saying that's what Lazarus was doing. I'm just saying, that would be one argument about it, I suppose.
That part is valid. It's just that verse sometimes gets lost in some of the discussions.
Yeah.